Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Dr. Lauren Green, and I serve as a medical advisor at the Dr. Susan Love Foundation for Breast Cancer Research. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'd like to take an opportunity to introduce you to our organization. The Dr. Susan Love Foundation challenges the status quo to end breast cancer through innovative research and improve the lives of people impacted through education and advocacy. We drive collaborative, cutting-edge research with non-traditional partners, shed light on the collateral damage of treatment, and actively seek ways to diminish it, and interpret science to empower breast cancer patients. Many of the projects the foundation undertakes are designed to increase our understanding of the human breast, where breast cancer starts, and what enables a malignancy to occur, with the ultimate goal of developing methods to prevent it in the first place. The foundation is also committed to participation in research that has the potential to positively impact the lives of all people who are at risk for or who have breast cancer. Breast cancer happens in people, so research needs to be done on human beings, and that means men, women, non-binary people, and everyone who gets breast cancer. Our Love Research Army, formerly known as the Army of Women, is committed to encouraging and facilitating breast cancer research in all people, regardless of age, race, gender, sexual identity, with or without a breast cancer diagnosis. We are committed to thoughtfully engaging over 380,000 members by providing them with ongoing real-time access to an array of studies. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's panelists. First, we have Dr. Wendy Berg, who has recently been named the Dr. Bernard F. Fisher Chair of Breast Cancer Clinical Science at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. Dr. Berg was principal investigator of the Akron 6666 trial on screening breast ultrasound and MRI, and has led and analyzed prospective trials evaluating nearly every breast imaging modality. Dr. Berg is Chief Scientific Advisor to densebreastinfo.org and has served on committees for multiple editions of the BI-RADS manual. She has over 130 peer-reviewed publications and has been co-lead author and editor of 3 editions of the book Diagnostic Imaging Breast and the associated content on the web-based radiology platform StatDX. Our next panelist is Dr. Linda Larson, who is a professor of clinical radiology at the Keck School of Medicine of USC, specializing in breast imaging. After completing her diagnostic radiology residency at UCLA and fellowship at the University of Miami, she joined the USC Department of Radiology, where for the last 16 years, she has been the director of breast imaging, overseeing multiple facilities. She serves as the vice chair of professional development for the Department of Radiology and is a member of the breast imaging task force for the Department of Health Services in Los Angeles County. Dr. Larson has been the principal investigator for several research projects initiated at USC and participates in national multi-site clinical trials evaluating new breast imaging modalities. And finally, I would like to introduce our third panelist, Ajit Jairaj, who is the Vice President of Research and Development at Kios Medical. He has a background in electrical engineering and digital signal processing and has over 10 years of experience developing products based around machine learning algorithms. As a founding member of Kios Medical, he leads his team in applying cutting-edge computer vision techniques to solve critical challenges in medical image interpretation and diagnosis. Today, Kios Medical has a worldwide presence and 2 FDA-cleared diagnostic products for thyroid and breast ultrasound. He will be available to answer any technical questions. And now we will hear from our first presenter, Dr. Berg.
Thank you. Trying to get this to advance. There we go. Sorry. So I'm going to be talking in general terms about new breakthroughs in artificial intelligence and how they may help us with access and equity issues in the future. I do have a disclosure. I have grant support from Kios for a separate project, but the support goes directly to the department. I'm voluntary chief scientific advisor to densebreastinfo.org and associate editor for Journal of Breast Imaging. By way of background, there are over 2 million new diagnoses of breast cancer worldwide in 2020. And low and middle income countries mostly lack access to organized screening for cancer and to technology, and therefore are overrepresented among breast cancer deaths. Breast cancer in these countries often presents as a lump, and younger women under age 50 are overrepresented among breast cancer deaths. In the United States, about a third of breast cancer presents in advanced stage 3 or 4. It's higher in Latin America, ranging from 30 to 50%, depending on the countries. And in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's no screening really at all, about 75% present in advanced stage. And of course, the prognosis is much worse in later stage diagnosis. The majority of these late stage disease identifications are due to findings that the patient herself has noted, not something that was seen on a clinical examination by a physician. A recent large initiative that was started by the Fred Hutchinson Center at University of Washington and the Komen Foundation jointly, the Breast Health Global Initiative, has attempted to define best practices with limited resources. And they published their findings in an issue of Cancer in May 2020. And one of the priorities for breast especially was the early detection of symptomatic cancer. This requires increased awareness of the findings, noticing a lump. It includes improved access to imaging of lumps and other symptoms, improved access to pathology, and improved access to treatment. And really, it's that second one, improved access to imaging of lumps and other symptoms, that we're going to focus on during this webinar. In general, there's of course a spectrum from healthy to abnormal cells to DCIS to invasive cancer, cancer spread, and ultimately death. With screening, of course, we're trying to identify cancers before they're symptomatic. This involves screening large numbers of women to find the few women who have cancer, requires infrastructure, technology, lots of training, advanced support personnel and physicians. But a more practical approach, especially in limited resource settings, is to focus on early diagnosis of the symptomatic disease. And that can often still be found before it has spread, certainly before it has spread to the rest of the body. And this then focuses only on a much smaller number of women who have symptoms, and should include the women with cancers, especially those that need treatment. In terms of equity issues, biopsies are generally only available in central diagnostic facilities where there's limited capacity and there may be long wait times. And so to improve access, one way to do that would be to increase the number of such facilities, but the other might be to reduce the number of women who need to be seen in those central diagnostic facilities. And that's, again, the approach we're going to focus on here. If we consider breast lumps, the best diagnostic test for these is actually ultrasound. And ultrasound can be very portable and low cost, and we'll talk more about that. Fewer than 10% of lumps are cancerous, especially in younger women under age 55. About 37%, by contrast, are malignant over the age of 55. Ultrasound is very effective in distinguishing between benign cysts, normal tissue, benign fibroadenomas, and cancer. Here are just a few examples. On the left is a cyst with some debris, complicated cyst with debris that was palpable. The middle is a fibroadenoma, and the far right is a cancer. It's more irregular. It's got some complex cystic and solid components to it. This case, however, was not so simple. Clinically, this was a 36-year-old woman who was breastfeeding, who had palpable lumps. The most common answer in this situation might be a galactocele or fibroadenomas. These look circumscribed. They're somewhat heterogeneous in ecotexture, but they do look well-defined, and that should favor benign etiology. And there is some internal flow, which argues against a lactating adenoma. But clinically, these were unfortunately called probably benign and recommended for follow-up. She presented 3 months later, and the masses had both enlarged, and you can see there's marked internal vascularity now. And these, unfortunately, were high-grade invasive cancers that were triple receptor positive. So even in the specialist's hands, mistakes can be made. And this just highlights the opportunity for perhaps computer-assisted diagnosis or artificial intelligence to help recognize the suspicious features up front and improve earlier diagnosis. Symptomatic cancers are well seen with ultrasound across multiple studies in the literature. This is a very large series Nemat Husami published years ago that showed about 81%, a little over 80% sensitivity of ultrasound and about 78% sensitivity for mammography. Combined together, about 91%. And importantly, ultrasound was more sensitive in younger women under age 62. And here's just a bar graph. You can see the number of cancers in white, and the blue are the percent of sensitivities of ultrasound compared to red mammography. And again, in younger age patients, the blue bars are higher than the red bars. The ultrasound sensitivity is better than mammography. It's not until you get above age 62 that mammography was more sensitive. Another series Connie Lehman published looking at nearly 1,000 women with symptomatic areas. Ultrasound correctly identified 96% of the cancers, 22 out of 23. And importantly, the negative predictive value of ultrasound was nearly 100%. Specificity was also quite high. So almost 84% of the benign lumps could be benign symptomatic areas could be recognized as benign on ultrasound, and in theory then would not necessarily need to have diagnostic assessment at a tertiary center. And meanwhile, mammography performed much worse in these younger women, only 61% of cancers seen, detecting one additional cancer at another site. And here are just those data we don't need to go through, but summarizing the specific numbers. In a prospective multi-center trial in the Netherlands that just was published, 1,961 women with symptoms. And again, ultrasound sensitivity was very high at that site, detecting all but 3 cancers. Tomosynthesis found only those 3 additional cancers at the site of complaint and 8 elsewhere, but very low yield from doing the tomosynthesis. That rate of 4 per 1,000 is very similar to what we expect from screening with tomosynthesis in general. So again, it highlights that ultrasound alone is actually very effective at identifying the cancers. And again, very high specificity of nearly 91% in this prospective multi-center trial. Again, suggesting that if you did an ultrasound locally, that you might be able to triage many of the benign lumps not needing further workup centrally. So again, here's the concept that local triage can be performed with ultrasound, in theory, with low-cost portable devices. Image acquisition and interpretation are 2 separate steps, and I want to focus on those because both of those have to be feasible for this approach to work. But if this can be done locally, then you can reduce the referral to tertiary centers, which would improve equity and access issues for those women who actually have cancer. So at least the initial interpretation can be done with AI. That part's not so difficult. It can be done either with cloud-based interpretation via cell phone or integrated into the ultrasound unit itself. And again, the focus would be to triage the benign lumps, to send the woman home, say you don't need to go travel for days or wait for months to be seen at a tertiary center. You don't have cancer. And it would allow prioritization of the women who have suspicious lumps to be seen faster at the tertiary referral center and reduce the burden on those centers. A bigger challenge historically with ultrasound has been image acquisition. With handheld ultrasound, this is typically performed by highly trained technologists or radiologists. It can be done with low-cost devices, but training those technologists or radiologists remains a problem. Automated ultrasound, which may not require as much training and actually acquires images potentially of the entirety of both breasts, generates over 1,000 images. It can be used for screening. It can also be used more focally for diagnosis. But unfortunately, it also still requires training of the person doing the exam. We found initially this was promised as something that maybe a medical assistant could do, but it actually requires pretty good technique, good contact, good pressure to reduce artifacts. And as I mentioned, it generates many, many images, which then are more challenging to interpret. So the initial pilot work that was led by the Love Foundation in Mexico was looking at the image acquisition and training individuals who were not technologists or radiologists, but rather minimally trained medical personnel who, including a GYN intern, a surgical nurse, and a medical student. They were given half an hour training with a PowerPoint that had illustrations of the knobology of its portable Vscan laptop-based ultrasound provided by GE Healthcare. They were taught scanning technique to mark an X on the skin over the area the patient was feeling, to acquire images in 2 planes, orthogonal planes, so that we had enough information to look at all the margins in principle, with and without calipers. And that's important because the calipers can obscure a portion of the margin of the lesions. And if that could be done successfully, then you have the potential for a computer-assisted interpretation of those images. The standard of care ultrasound was also done on the same patients in this pilot study by a radiologist. And we used, as I said, the dual scan probe, which was 8 millihertz at that time. Both the radiologist and the minimally trained observers did image acquisition. There were 32 masses in this study, including 2 cancers. And then those masses were reviewed by the AI, which at that time was called Triage CADX. This became what is now Kios. And this is the outputs at that time were either benign or suspicious. And there was also a numeric score that was more or less a relative concern for malignancy from 0 to 1, 1 being much more likely malignant. And here are just some examples of the images that were obtained, and the output would put a box would be drawn over the lesion, and then it would be rated as either suspicious in red or benign in green. And these were correctly classified in these 2 cases. Here's an example of the orthogonal images that were acquired on the left by a minimally trained observer and on the right by a radiologist, and they really are visually almost identical. And overall, of those 32 masses, the 2 cancers were given very suspicious ratings with the CADX, you can see in the red diamonds. And then many of the lesions that were benign in reality, and actually biopsy proven benign, the radiologist had thought they needed biopsy, but the CADX system was able to correctly assess them as benign, and in principle could have reduced the number of benign biopsies quite a bit. And there were no errors in this initial pilot study. More recent study using the more current version of the Kios decision support software was led by Vicky Mango et al. At Sloan Kettering, looking at 900 breast masses, of which nearly half were malignant, median size of 14 millimeters. So these are a little bit smaller, still many were palpable. And they looked at how the CAD product or the AI could influence physicians, including 11 radiologists, 2 OBGYNs, and 2 breast surgeons. Importantly, the Kios software alone had a AUC, closer to 1 the better, AUC of 0.88, which was actually better than the mean reader performance at 0.83. And when the readers had the ability to look at the Kios output, their performance did improve, which is very good. And here is a graph showing the dotted line is if they were the same before and after the CAD or AI in this case. And there's only 1 observer that performed slightly worse and had very high performance to start with. And everyone else actually showed better performance using the AI decision support. So that was all very encouraging. And these preliminary results prompted the NIH-funded prospective study in Jalisco, Mexico, that Ana Lilia Lopez Aldrete was the site PI. And we just published these results in Radiology. The purpose of the study was to see whether the low and middle income country could use portable ultrasound with low-cost devices, minimally trained observers to triage management of women with palpable masses. We enrolled women who were at least 18 years of age and had a palpable lump. This was IRB approved, HIPAA compliant, single center study. The target was to include 500 women These women would have usual care ultrasound and also ultrasound done on the portable device, both by the minimally trained observer and by the radiologist, with AI, which was the KIOS decision support evaluation of the portable images. As I mentioned, this was funded by the NCI, used devices provided by GE Healthcare, and AI by KIOS. The study took place from December 2017 to May of 2021. And the minimally trained observers were actually 3 research coordinators who were trained in obtaining orthogonal paired images of the breast masses with and without calipers. This used the Vscan Extend, which had a little higher frequency. And also the standard of care ultrasound was performed and interpreted by the radiologist, given a BI-RADS assessment and biopsied if needed. Sorry. There were a few limitations that palpable lumps that appeared to be normal breast tissue were not documented, but they did include documentation of non-palpable incidental masses that were seen. Sorry. And we had at least 12-month follow-up of the probably benign masses that were included in analysis. The software version that was used was 3.x. This is FDA approved. At that time, the software had been trained on over 700,000 curated images from about 40 clinical sites, representing all major makes and manufacturers, including 17 different models and a range of transducers. It had not been, importantly, had not been trained on the Vscan images themselves of any history of that. The software is currently embedded across all GE platforms, and there are discussions with other manufacturers as well. It is embedded on PACS systems and can be used directly that way. And there is a CPT code for billing for both breast and thyroid applications. Here's a flowchart indicating the exclusions of patients. We actually enrolled 478 women. Apologize, chronic cough, with 1,216 lesions, but we had to exclude women where the lump was larger than the 29 millimeter footprint of the transducer, or where they were lymph nodes or skin lesions, where the software has not been trained on that type of lesion. There were some BI-RADS 3 masses with no follow-up, and there were some that were missing images, unfortunately, for analysis. In the end, we had 758 masses to evaluate, of which 56, or 7%, were malignant. And this is in 300 women, of whom 16% had cancer. There's a lot of information on this slide, but I'll walk you through it. Basically, we have data from the standard of care ultrasound, or SOC. Sorry, in the second column, portable ultrasound in the first column. And you can see at the participant level, the AUC was very high for both 0.91 or 0.95. Sensitivity was also quite high at 96 to 98%, and specificity, which was also the goal, was modest for the portable ultrasound images at 38% and high at 67% for standard of care. Again, these results are very encouraging. Here is an example of one of the problematic lesions that was considered probably benign on the Vscan. And actually, I should have mentioned the outputs from the current KIOS software are benign, probably benign, suspicious, or malignant. And on the Vscan images, this looks almost like a cyst, and I think reasonably was considered probably benign by the software. But the standard of care images on the bottom, you can see there's a little microlobulation of the margin, and that was then classified appropriately as suspicious by the software. And this was low-grade DCIS. This is a more complicated case of a 60-year-old woman who had 2 palpable masses. The top images are the V-scan images that were rated as suspicious. It's kind of heterogeneously hypoechoic on the upper images in A, but the images in B from the standard of care ultrasound were considered probably benign. It's got more homogeneous internal echotexture. The Doppler image at C has internal vascularity, but that's not currently included in the software. And so that was kind of a miss, if you will, on the standard of care ultrasound classification. And this patient also had a second very irregular, highly suspicious mass shown in D that was classified appropriately as probably malignant, but both of these masses were cancer. Now, one of the things about the software is that it does not consider other masses in the same patient. Sorry. We know that a patient who has a current cancer, that other lesions that we might otherwise consider probably benign are more likely to be malignant, but the software does not currently do that. So this is another limitation that needs to be considered going forward. We also looked at performance when the images were obtained by the radiologist as opposed to the minimally trained observer. And again, the same columns, you can see that with standard of care ultrasound, the sensitivity and AUC were very high, 0.97, 0.98. And with the portable ultrasound, even the low-cost portable ultrasound machine, the images, when they were obtained by the radiologist, the software did very well. 100% sensitivity, 98%, or sorry, 0.98 AUC. With the minimally trained observers, however, on the bottom, there was reduced performance in the with the portable ultrasound images and also with the standard of care images, suggesting that more training is needed to get adequate image quality from minimally trained observers. So in conclusion, the radiologist could generate images using the low-cost unit with AI performance that was similar to standard of care ultrasound. I didn't highlight it, but 52% of women with benign masses could be triaged in that set of circumstances. As I mentioned, better training of the minimally trained observers is needed. And the AI, as I mentioned, has not been trained on the V-scan images at all historically, either the 8 millihertz or the 12 megahertz images. And that's something that these results are pretty amazing considering the lack of exposure to such images. So better results should be expected with the newer version of the V-scan portable device. It has a higher frequency transducer, wider footprint. The specifications are much more similar to what was standard of care ultrasound in this country during the Akron 6666 trial. And so we are very optimistic that going forward, the results should only be better. So with this said, I'm going to turn things over now to my friend and colleague, Dr. Linda Larson, who will discuss some of these issues as well.
So hi, everybody. Wendy, that was great. Thank you. My name is Linda Larson. I'm a breast imager at USC, University of Southern California in Los Angeles, California. I have no disclosures. As Dr. Berg just mentioned, just to reiterate, this is a very important project because of the great need for AI portable ultrasound in Mexico and women with palpable lumps. I think I skipped way too many. Let me go back. Sorry about that. So we really did need it in Mexico for women with palpable lumps. As you know, a delay in healthcare is associated with advanced disease. Here's a picture of the trainees that Dr. Berg talked about in the pilot study in Guadalajara before the larger clinical study was done. In this pilot study, the trainees who were a second-year medical student, OR nurse, gynecological intern, took images with the V-scan portable ultrasound, and those were compared with the radiologist images of the 32 breast masses, and their images were just as good as the radiologist, so AI could be used on those images as well. And some of the comments by the trainees: the device was easy to use. It could be really important for the population that we serve because it will allow us to identify many lumps. I thought it would be hard to learn how it works, but it was easy. It really does look like a cell phone, but with the menu and the arrows, it was pretty clear. So those are really great comments by the trainees. In addition, the patients' thoughts were very heartwarming. I hope this is something that can improve or facilitate our care. I'm doing this for us, for all women. Another comment was, imagine living all this time with the uncertainty, the nervousness that it may be bad, and the knowledge that there can be risks when you have to wait so long for a test. And the patient here in this picture was a volunteer who woke up at 1 in the morning to take a 6-hour bus trip to Guadalajara to participate in this study. So, of course, it was a good study. We're happy with the results, but as usual, there's always room for improvement. And Dr. Berg mentioned a lot of these already. How can we improve the study? Well, there's already a new and improved version of the V-scan portable ultrasound called the V-scan Air. This has a higher frequency transducer, which means higher resolution and better images. Also, since it is FDA approved, we can use the images from this unit to better train the AI algorithms so that the AI assessment is better. And also, like Dr. Berg mentioned, we also want to include the multiple lesions per patient in the AI assessment, because if a woman already has a cancer and there's another lesion in the same quadrant or same breast, that increases the chances of it being a cancer. So this information would be important for the AI assessment. Also, Doppler imaging of a lesion is important. When there is no vascularity, it's usually associated with a benign lesion. So AI would also benefit from this information. And finally, we can provide greater training of the personnel, emphasizing improving ultrasound technique, taking better pictures with and without measurements. And in addition to having the need for this in Mexico, we also need it in some parts of the United States. Recently, the American Cancer Society looked at equity of healthcare and found that Hispanics are less likely than non-Hispanic whites to be diagnosed with breast cancer at a localized stage. And one reason is that maybe Hispanics have lower rates of actually using mammography, and they tend to delay their follow-up of abnormal screening results, as well as delaying medical attention for lumps they discover, for their breast lumps or any breast abnormalities. Also, the American Cancer Society found that Hispanic women are less likely to receive appropriate and timely breast cancer treatment. They're usually diagnosed with larger tumors and more likely to have hormone receptor negative tumors, which are harder to treat. With our own metrics at the DHS, Department of Health Services, of which we are 5 county hospitals in LA, I've just listed as A through E. In our own system, we're E here where I work, we experience a delay from the time we recommend a biopsy to the time the biopsy is performed. Our goal is less than 15 days from the time we recommend to the time performed. And you can see from our numbers here, only 58% of our patients meet that goal. So over 40% of our patients have to wait over 3 weeks, at least 3 weeks, to be biopsied and get a diagnosis. So the AI portable ultrasound will definitely fill a need in the underserved areas here in Los Angeles with largely Hispanic and Black populations, where we can triage women with breast lumps. So I think most of these women in their community setting go to the urgent cares there or the ERs there, and we can use this AI portable ultrasound in that facility to triage the patients. A lot of them also go to the internal medicine or family medicine clinic in their neighborhoods, where we can also have a navigator or non-doctor triage these patients with the AI portable ultrasound. I think less urgent, where I think AI would be useful for us, is, as most of you are aware, with the dense breasts, new recommendations are that we offer supplemental screening, either ultrasound or MRI. And in most facilities, the screening breast ultrasound is done by an ultrasound technologist, and where their skills are very varied, some very confident and some less experienced. So I think AI may also be good to double read the ultrasound technologists as they perform screening breast ultrasound. Radiologists double reading the studies. I think the radiologists, this is kind of a tough question. I think they should double read, or the diagnostic breast ultrasounds, but I'm really mixed about this. I haven't thought carefully enough about that. I was also asked obstacles of this new technology reaching the market. I think the biggest hurdle is the regulatory approvals by the FDA, which is very rigorous and time consuming. We also need clinical validation to demonstrate safety, efficacy, and accuracy. Data availability is also a little challenging. For the AI algorithms, they need thousands and thousands of images to improve the AI algorithm. So we need data sets with breast masses seen on ultrasound where the lesion is marked and the established truth is with biopsy or cancer, no cancer at 1 year. So that may be challenging to get all those cases. Technical challenges with AI is usually overcoming the image quality variations and artifacts. Technique has to be cost effective compared to alternatives, affordable, and is of course reimbursable. And user acceptance and adoption is important. It's important to show patient care improvement. How do we show that? Well, clinical trial with women with palpable lumps who are evaluated AI portable ultrasound by non-radiologists versus a standard care. The endpoints would likely be wait times from presentation to diagnosis. Do we find tumor size smaller in these women triaged with the portable AI ultrasound? Stage as well as treatment, are they less invasive treatments, breast conserving surgery versus mastectomy with or without chemo? Also, challenges for widespread use of this technology. It needs to be accessible and affordable. You know, we may have to partner with healthcare providers, insurance companies, or even government initiatives, like especially for the county facilities in these large cities. Education and training are essential. The people using this equipment have to know how to use it and be successful using it in order for it to be effective. Distribution and infrastructure, we want to be able to reach the remote areas with the limited resources that can most benefit from this AI portable ultrasound. And we also have to maintain long-term support and updates with the healthcare partners that are using it to make sure we keep them in the loop when we do improve the product and advance the AI software. I think that's all she wrote for me. So.
Okay, I would like to thank Dr. Berg and Dr. Larson for the excellent presentations. We will now be moving on to the question portion of our webinar. And to the attendees, if you have any questions, you can feel free to type them type them in and we will try to read them off one by one, time allowing. So our first question, you mentioned lumps a lot, but ILC very seldomly presents as a lump. Can you please make sure to address ILC and not IDC? So that should be referring to invasive lobular carcinoma.
So I can take this a little bit, and I may have a comment on this as well from Kios. We've actually talked about this issue. There were no cases of invasive lobular carcinoma in this study, which was interesting to me because we expected to be about 15% of all cancers. We certainly do see it as lumps in the United States, but it can be more infiltrative and more subtle in imaging, of course, as well. It does seem that the AI software performs perfectly well on an ILC when you're imaging it, but the key in the setting of women who are only going to be seen if they're symptomatic, you may not pick it up until it's larger. I mean, I think that's the challenge. It's always been the challenge with invasive lobular cancer. Even with screening, we miss more of it, especially on mammography. And it may also be somewhat difficult, even when it's symptomatic, it's not always obvious. Sometimes it can be a speculated mass, but not always. So I know Ajit mentioned that they have a database that has, I don't know, maybe at least in the 70-ish range of invasive lobular cancers. And we were thinking about systematically collecting more and looking at its performance. It was a source of missed cancers, even with the technologists doing handheld ultrasound in our own study that we just published in 2023. Looking at screening ultrasound, it can be subtle on ultrasound, period. Even though ultrasound is better than mammography for ILC, it's not always perfect for that. Ajit, did you want to say something? Yeah.
I think you covered it pretty well. The system as it is performs pretty well on ILC from our observations, and really the focus on palpable lumps for this particular study did limit the amount of ILC that we encountered.
Okay, thank you. So our next question was wondering why a gynecology intern was selected as one of the users in the study.
I mean, in this study, it wasn't a gynecology intern, it was just research coordinators. But in the pilot study, I think it just happened that there were some, relatively speaking, volunteers who were available who were interested. I think it was more opportunistic than deliberate in terms of who the minimally trained folks were, if you will. You know, it is true that GYN, I guess the question really gets to the fact that they might have some experience already with breast ultrasound and maybe they're not so minimally trained, and that's certainly possible. But I know the medical student for a fact had no experience prior to it, and the nurse also had no experience prior to the trial. So I think, and it was a small series, no matter how you look at it. In the current study, as I mentioned, these were research coordinators who had no prior experience, and the performance was worse. So, I think at least we know it was honest and done in an honest way. But it does speak to the need for greater training. And again, it might be that with better equipment, the image quality would be better either way, even with not additional training. The only other study I know of that's looked at sort of these training issues, well, a couple of approaches, but there's one, I think it was in Rwanda, where they trained for 7 weeks. They trained nurses to do the ultrasound, but they were trying to teach them interpretation as well. And that's a much harder task. So getting good image quality, even if it requires a few-day training course, that should be feasible to do it in that period of time. That's what they did in Japan for the screening study, the JSTART screening ultrasound study. And they had people of various backgrounds in that, many different types of physicians, as well as allied healthcare professionals doing the ultrasound screening. They had a 2 or 3 day course with videos, models that they scanned and trained them people to scan, and everything else. So I think it's certainly feasible to do something like that. Whether it's feasible to cut that down to just a PowerPoint, I'm not sure.
Okay, we have another question. The improvement in specificity by radiologists over minimally trained individuals was impressive. Do you have information on whether it was an ascertainment or interpretation problem? How can you address this in future training?
Well, again, this study really was looking at images, not so much the interpretation. So there was no fundamental bias. This was just image quality issues because they were looking at the same lesion. It's not an ascertainment problem per se, and it wasn't an interpretation problem per se. It was just that the image quality was not as good. Probably they didn't have, I mean, they may have less attention to the margins as they're scanning. They may have less pressure on the lesion, which would reduce image quality. We did try to look at sort of depth and whatnot. We couldn't really find a systematic error in the acquisition of the images. But, I think that is always something to look at, is how, are they applying the same amount of pressure? I know that's certainly an issue when I'm training radiology residents and things like that to do the ultrasound. Sometimes we had lesions that were too big for the field of view. And again, they may have, a radiologist might have been able to angle it in such a way to really capture all the edges better than a minimally trained observer. So there's certain issues like that were problematic with this device, but the field of view was only 29 millimeters, which is pretty small when you're looking at lumps. So current transducers are 5 centimeters with the current equipment that's used, and that should help with that issue as well. But it's a good question. It's, maybe there's subtle features that they're not noticing and not documenting because they're not noticing. So there could be some ascertainment issue there. A little hard to tell for sure. But I think looking at the cases that we looked at where there were misclassifications, it's not that they were so obvious a problem on the images one way or the other. It's just subtle, very subtle differences.
And they did very well for the amount of training they did have.
Correct.
Yeah, so.
And even with the minimally trained observers, it was still, I think, 37% could correctly be triaged. It's just that we missed a few cancers. So you're less confident about that.
Okay, does the AI software receive cine mode, or are images sent after freezing?
A good question. With this device and setup and CADStudy software, it does not get cine mode images. It's just the still images that were captured by the person taking the pictures. We've talked about the desirability, if you will, of being able to, especially when it's on the equipment, to be able to recognize a lesion while someone's got a transducer on the patient and say, stop, there's something there. Wouldn't that be great? And I think that is eventually feasible, but it's not the approach that's being used. I have seen talks, at least I know there was a talk at RSNA along these lines where they were using cine loops, but they were still having to identify the lesion on the cine loop. So that wasn't so easy either. And I think that is the holy grail. With automated ultrasound, CADStudy is used on the automated ultrasound. And again, Ajit can speak to this more. So you do have thousands of images there, and you can pick out the cancers well on automated ultrasound as well. So it speaks to the feasibility, if you will, of that kind of approach of maybe looking at cine loops and all, but the logistics of transferring cine loops and reviewing them are not simple right now. Unfortunately, even looking at still images on ultrasound, the name and whatnot are often embedded on the image on older equipment. It's better now in the last few years, but that's been a little bit always challenging to look at research and ultrasound for that reason. It's just more complicated, and it's worse for cine loops.
Okay, so would this be a good tool to use for triage in low access locations?
In the United States, for example?
Not specified.
I mean, I think, that is a good question. And there are plenty of areas in the United States where there are long wait times and there's a long travel time to get to a tertiary center. I think here, of course, we have a lot of lawyers, so you'd have to have pretty darn close to 100% sensitivity. I think it's certainly feasible, for example, to have this function as an initial reading on site, as long as it's double read by a radiologist. But all of these issues with AI are being discussed and vetted right now in terms of who's ultimately responsible if there's a miss. We know from separate research that we've done with CADStudy that the performance is almost identical to a specialist radiologist. We're not perfect, it's not perfect, and it actually tends to miss the same things that we miss. One of the things that we've been working on is looking at triple negative cancers, because they can mimic cysts at times. And we have been able to show improvement in that regard, which will make it better than the radiologist even. But it's still, nothing's going to be perfect ever, I think. And then the question is, who's responsible? Is the AI company responsible for the miss, or is there always a radiologist who's going to look at it later? And currently, most centers that are using AI clinically, for example, in Europe, they are using it as a second reader. And it is certainly cost effective in that sort of situation where they do second reads, they do double read for mammography. With ultrasound, we don't really do that in this country right now. So it's just a question of whether it could help, but it certainly has been shown to improve the performance for general radiologists, for non-specialists. And if you had, you didn't have an expert in breast imaging in a remote area, you could certainly expect comparable performance to an expert radiologist, which would improve the level of care in the remote areas. So I would say the short answer is yes, but with a little asterisk about specifics in the implementation. Linda, what do you think?
I think we could use it just exactly for the reason you said, in areas where you don't have a breast specialist and you do have much inexperienced radiologists, because that's where AI really helps with the inexperienced or the general radiologist. So I think we could use it in those areas, especially to triage. If there's a long wait time to see a referring specialist, you can definitely triage the more suspicious cases.
Has any work been done on non-GE ultrasound?
Not in a remote setting, like in the study per se, but Kio software has been validated on, I think, across 17 different platforms, all makes and manufacturers. They have, it was 700,000 images they'd reviewed when we did this processing, and it's well over 1 million now that they've looked at. So yes, it is something that's being used on all different makes and manufacturers right now. And it's FDA approved, so that's not a problem. It's just that obviously the performance will be better if it's seen prior images on a given machine. So I don't know. I think that's one. It speaks to a larger question in implementation that we didn't really touch on, and that is, if you're going to start using a new ultrasound unit, you probably should do some kind of validation first with a series of cases to make sure how it performs on that. Would you agree, Ajit, or do you have some more to add to that?
Yeah, I think doing a little bit of validation is always a good idea. I think in terms of the VScan, those images look quite different from your standard cart-based system just because of the difference in frequency. And the fact that our system generalized as well as it did was a nice surprise for us. And B, does speak to the fact that the system should work on pretty much all standard cart-based systems with a reasonable degree of quality.
Agreed.
Okay, our next question is, these findings are extremely promising. Essentially, technology now enables everyone to have access to an expert caliber diagnosis. What is your vision for building upon this initial success?
So I think, with adequate funding, the sky's the limit, basically. I mean, this seems like we have a very strong proof of principle here. And, there are some major initiatives going on. I know Amazon has an initiative to really extend broadband internet worldwide through a number of satellites and things, for example, which that reduces the obstacle in principle of having this, software either on a cell phone or sending the image to the cloud and getting a real-time answer. If you've got good internet, you can do that. And you can do that already. So I think a lot of this is just really starting to, if it were me, I would do this with deployment and simultaneous evidence collection, if you will, because I think it's very much needed. I think there's every expectation it would work. And you just want to make sure that you're monitoring your outcomes as you're doing it. I think there are plenty of opportunities to do that in a randomized controlled fashion prospectively, and that would be ideal so that there'd be no question about the outcomes and the benefits. Linda did outline some of the potential, how the trial might be designed to do that in an optimal way. But I think, it's almost criminal not to start doing this in real life. And it's so inexpensive. And these ultrasound devices are so portable and so inexpensive that it seems extremely feasible right now. And, you know, the rest is just doing it, if you will.
Yeah. Like when you said almost criminal not to provide this service to people.
Can ultrasound in combination with AI be equivalent to 2D plus 3D mammography?
So I actually had a slide, but I hit it. We did an analysis looking at the Akron 6666 data. We had independent readings of the ultrasound and the mammogram in that study. So we were able to look at how things would perform. Now, mind you, there was, I think, only about a third of those cases were tomosynthesis at that time, but ultrasound found more of the invasive cancers than did mammography. In the most recent study that we did, it wasn't blinded, but the order of reading was altered. One reader read the ultrasound first, the other read tomosynthesis first. The sensitivity was a little bit lower in that study that we just published, the DB-TUS study in Journal of Clinical Oncology this year, January. But I think in that situation, we had more misses of the cancers that on the screening ultrasound by the technologist. So it's a little harder to say. You know, physician-performed ultrasound can perform as well as mammography, for sure, but screening, you know, in Asia, it performs very well in small, dense breasts, and mammography is not as good in the small, dense breasts. In Western Pennsylvania, we have much larger breasted women, and it's maybe not as ideal of a test for screening. Automated ultrasound, again, if you add CAD or AI to automated ultrasound, you should get better results as well. It's always, the challenge there has been interpretation because of the thousands of images, the fatigue, the artifacts from the shadowing at the edges of fat lobules and things like that. If you can resolve all that, then you could, in theory, do screening with automated ultrasound and deploy that well. I think deploying handheld screening ultrasound in a broad fashion is hard because it does require good quality, simultaneous image acquisition and almost interpretation. If you're not seeing something, you won't document it. And that's a problem. And we found that was a problem even with our highly trained technologists who had a year of mentoring and all that before they were allowed to do screening ultrasound. So, you know, there are places, China does it. They have specialists who do nothing but ultrasound. They're doctors, they do nothing but ultrasound. That's a little different story. Maybe they can do screening ultrasound efficiently that way. But I think most of the rest of the world, you would need something more automated to use ultrasound for screening in a broad way. But yes, you can find the invasive cancers certainly as well as you can with mammograms if done appropriately.
Okay, so unfortunately, we are out of time for today. I'd like to give a very big thank you to Dr. Berg, Dr. Larson, and Ajit Jairaj for participating in our panel today. And thank you so much to the audience for joining us and for your questions. If you have any questions that were not answered today or would like to get in touch with the Foundation about the Love Research Army or any of our research initiatives, please email info@drsusanloveresearch.org. Today's webinar has been recorded and will soon be posted to our website, which is linked in the chat box for your convenience. I also encourage you to visit our website if you are interested in learning more about the Foundation or making a donation in support of our research. I would again like to thank each of our panelists today for joining us, and I hope all of you are staying safe and healthy. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.